What would you say the biggest misconceptions are that people have around fertility nutrition?
I think one of the biggest ones is that the Mediterranean diet is the best diet for fertility. We do have data that the Mediterranean diet seems to be overall supportive of fertility in some of the trials, but I will say most of the time the intervention is taking people off of a standard American diet and putting them on a Mediterranean diet. And you're going to have a net benefit from that change because generally you're switching to a diet that has more unprocessed foods, less sugar, less added highly processed fats. So that's going to be a net positive. But our whole Western definition of Mediterranean diet is incorrect. So when you look at what people actually eat in the Mediterranean, first of all, it's not one dietary pattern. There's 21 countries that border the Mediterranean Sea. And the diet varies pretty widely. What we know of as the Mediterranean diet was actually what Ancel Keys called a Mediterranean diet when he was doing his 7 countries study. And he only looked at 2 different places in the Mediterranean. And so that was extrapolated to be the Mediterranean diet. He was also visiting during Lent when they were collecting some of the research. So you had people not eating meat for a period of time for religious reasons, and yet that's the time that they're doing dietary surveys. Some of the areas had been hard hit by World War II, so people were eating differently simply because they couldn't afford as much animal foods as maybe they normally would have eaten. Some of the studies, interestingly, on a Mediterranean diet, when you put women on it, there's a higher rate of ovulatory issues, probably because you have reduced their protein, their animal foods, and their fat intake. And when you reduce your fat intake, especially saturated fat, and the cholesterol that usually comes along with it in animal foods, you see a decrease in estrogen and progesterone levels as well, which can be enough in some cases to actually halt ovulation for a period of time.
Wow. So essentially the definition that we have of the Mediterranean diet as it's lauded in the medical literature is basically a skewed version of what the Mediterranean diet actually looks like.
Yes, all defined by this very biased researcher who we all know. Ancel Keys was the, father of the diet heart hypothesis. He's really the reason that people still are so fearful of eating saturated fat and cholesterol from their food.
Yeah, often when I hear the Mediterranean diet described, it's like the first thing you hear is like it's a grain-based diet. It's like rich in whole grains, low in saturated fat. And I mean, I haven't spent, too much time in these Mediterranean countries, but I mean, often it's like there's like leg of lamb on the table and sliced like charcuterie board, delicacies and things like that. So yeah, I guess it all stems back to this one person's time in this town during a very specific slice of history where I guess meat was harder to come by, and it also fit the narrative at the time, right? That they were
100%.
That they were trying to get to the root cause of heart disease, and saturated fat was really under the magnifying glass at that time. And the hypothesis that then has sort of rippled throughout time since and formed the basis of our dietary guidelines is that saturated fat is bad.
100%.
Well, that's it for that for this episode. No, but that's infuriating. And so we're told over and over again to adopt this diet. And some people will see their health improve, right? Because any improvement on the standard American diet is going to generally lead to better outcomes. But it's flawed.
It's flawed for sure. So when you go to different areas of the Mediterranean, and I put out like years ago, I was just questioning the Mediterranean diet a little more. And I put out a thing on my Instagram asking for, hey, if you live in the Mediterranean or have family that did or whatever, like tell me about what your diet is. And I mean, it varies so widely. What people are eating in Turkey is a lot different than what they're eating in Italy. And even the different areas that are more landlocked are going to have more meat, more high-fat dairy. Areas that are more coastal, which is the areas that Ancel Keys were looking at, they do have more fish intake. So their fatty acid profile is going to be different than people living up in the mountains, for example. And so our whole concept of a Mediterranean diet just like misses the mark on that particular point. So, yeah, and I think for a lot of people, since they're told to limit their intake of red meat specifically on a Mediterranean diet, which again is not reflective of traditional patterns in some of the areas in the Mediterranean, then you're actually decreasing your nutrient intake. So you're taking in less iron, less zinc, less of these key amino acids that are really supportive of both male and female fertility, like carnitine and creatine and glycine and taurine. You're taking in less fat-soluble vitamins. It can create a whole slew of carryover problems. So, if somebody's definition of a Mediterranean diet is more traditional to the region, like I have no issues with it. It's probably going to be a net benefit. But if their definition of it is this sort of Western idea that's like super high in grains, low in fat, only fish, limit meat, only low-fat dairy products, you're going to run into problems. And some of our biggest dietary studies that we have on fertility, specifically in female fertility and ovulatory function, interestingly, the group that had the highest carbohydrate intake, which was about 60% of calories from carbs, which falls right in line with our dietary guidelines, by the way, they actually had the highest rate of ovulatory issues of all the groups. And the groups that had the highest fat intake, particularly saturated fats, they had the lowest rates of ovulatory issues.
Wow.
Yeah.
So those who had the highest intake of saturated fat had the lowest. But yet saturated fat continues to be vilified. I mean, we're seeing now, there are all these restaurant chains now that are promoting a swap from, industrial refined bleached and deodorized seed oils to using tallow in the fryers, and they're getting serious pushback from the so-called evidence-based community. Like there continues to be this rhetoric that saturated fat is like somehow the worst thing that we could be putting into our bodies.
Yeah.
But at least you're saying from the standpoint of fertility, it appears to be potentially quite beneficial.
Correct. And they actually have done controlled feeding studies. This is outside of the fertility world, where you manipulate the level of carbohydrates and saturated fat, and you look at and see what happens with blood lipids. And you actually see improvements in blood lipids when people are on the higher saturated fat, lower carbohydrate diet relative to the reverse. So it all has to do with the dietary makeup. At the end of the day, like in the US, most people who are eating a higher level of saturated fat, when you're just looking at like a large population study, you're not trying to manipulate anybody's diet. The people who are eating more saturated fat are usually getting it from ultra-processed foods. So if that's where the saturated fat is coming from, then it's also coming with all sorts of other garbage, right? It's probably packaged in something that's high in sugar and refined carbohydrates and then has all sorts of additives. That's going to be a net negative. But when you look at when the fat is coming from whole food sources like red meat, whole fat dairy products, dark chocolate, things like that, we don't see the same negative effect on cardiovascular health. So it really comes down to the dietary pattern. Like the challenge with nutrition research is we're always trying to isolate one little component and extrapolate meaning from that. And so like the way that we run study designs often is trying to limit the number of confounding variables, but then sometimes you miss the bigger picture.
So you're saying that it's not necessarily the saturated fat that's causing the health problems that we see at the population level in people who consume more saturated fat. It's that it's like a surrogate proxy indicator for just ultra-processed food consumption, typically.
Correct.
Yeah, I remember reading literature from the USDA that showed that only 3% of the saturated fat that your average American consumes comes from like lean steak, for example.
Right.
The vast majority comes from ultra-processed food. So it's like we're demonizing red meat when that's not the vehicle by which most people are even ingesting saturated fat. It's similar to me, like when I read, when I saw the data on sodium intake, that like 7% of the sodium intake that your average American ingests comes from their salt shaker. Like the vast majority comes from ultra-processed foods or restaurant foods and the like. And yet we demonize the salt shaker. We tell people to eat less salt.
Yep.
Not eat fewer ultra-processed foods.
Exactly.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what then? So if you had to describe the ideal diet to optimize fertility for women and then we'll get to men. But for women, how would you describe it?
Well, for women and men, it would actually be really similar.
Huh.
Yeah. So first things first is I would get people to consume enough protein. For women especially, they tend to underconsume. Our dietary guidelines completely miss the mark on protein recommendations. I talked about that with pregnancy probably on our previous episode, but same goes for like general adults. I actually think all age groups, they're a significant underestimate. So more protein, and specifically more high quality protein, meaning animal protein, which then naturally is going to come with some fat unless you're obsessively taking it out of every single thing. But more animal protein, this vastly improves menstrual cycle regularity, ovulatory function, egg quality, conception rates, micronutrient intake, because really a lot of our tricky to obtain micronutrients are found in protein-rich animal foods. So that's where I start first. And naturally, that helps people regulate their hunger and fullness cues, regulate their blood sugar levels, which has a huge effect on fertility, and gets their inflammation levels down. So if we can get their protein levels up, a lot of the other dietary stuff kind of falls into place. You're naturally not going to be as hungry for the ultra processed foods, so consumption of those will come down. It probably means your carbohydrate intake will come down a little bit too, at least from the ultra processed sources. And then I'm looking at like, what is the quality of the rest of the diet, right? What's the quality of the carbs coming in? Is it coming in from white bread and potato chips, or is it coming in from, sweet potato and winter squash and fruit and, whole fat dairy products? Like, no issues with those. Legumes, even some whole grains. I'm not against grains either, but like quality sources that haven't been processed to remove the nutrients, to remove the fiber, which typically, as you remove those things from the product, you get, higher blood sugar levels, more cravings, more overeating as a whole. And then the next place I look is the quality of fat. So, of course, you now know I'm a fan of whole food saturated fats. Those are fine. The animal fats are good. Coconut oil, avocado oil, olive oil, unprocessed oils, and getting away from the highly processed, seed oils and excess of omega-6 that so many people are consuming.
Yeah, there's data that suggests that the maternal levels of linoleic acid, right, make their way into breast milk.
Oh, yeah.
And there's uncertainty about how that affects like the newborn's brain, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, a lot of the omega-6 and omega-3 kind of compete against one another for like receptor sites. So if you have somebody who's consuming a whole lot of omega-6, that can impact the distribution and metabolism of omega-3 fats as well. And you get into some controversial territory, but the quality of breast milk, meaning like the fatty acid makeup, fatty acid profile, the micronutrient levels for not all, but the majority of micronutrients, those are reflective of maternal intake and maternal nutrient stores. Like, this is such a controversial topic. So like, I kind of didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, but I did actually teach like a 2-hour webinar on nutrient transfer into breast milk based on maternal intake and nutrient status. And it's wild. Like, it's not just the DHA that transfers into the milk. It's any of the fatty acids that you're consuming, including trans fats. And that we know has a negative detrimental effect on baby's development. But like vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin D for sure. Most of the B vitamins, the majority of the minerals, like what a mom eats affects the quality of the breast milk. And nobody's talking about it because we don't want to create another barrier to breastfeeding. I get it. Like, I breastfed both of my kids. I've been there, done that. It's work, and you don't want to put out information that's going to dissuade women from nursing because they feel like they have to eat perfectly or something in order to make good quality breast milk. And that's not 100% like the message that I'm even sending here either. It's that like we can level up the nutrient value of it if we treat ourselves well and nourish ourselves well. And guess what? You heal better postpartum. Your fertility is better preserved for if you want to go on to have another child. Like, it's a net benefit for everybody if mom is well nourished.
You're probably also influencing your child's health, like long term, even into adulthood, because maternal diets influence like the palates of
Oh,
newborns.
Yeah. The flavor exposure, all the way back to in utero exposure, like the flavor of the amniotic fluid changes based on what a mother eats, but for sure in the breast milk as well. And then that goes on into weaning as you introduce complementary foods. The more variety of foods that you introduce, the greater the chances that your child will be willing to eat them. That said, as a mother to a 9 and a 5-year-old, there are, I believe, natural stages of development where kids will be pickier than others. And my older one has completely outgrown that, and he eats absolutely everything. We went out for dinner and he had like raw oysters the other day and thought they were great. So I'm like, okay. He outgrew the picky phase, but he did go through a picky phase. And I mean, he had great exposure to a huge variety of foods, and it was just a phase. And my 5-year-old is in and out of the picky stage, but I know she'll come around eventually. It's just, so,
But it's like a phase.
Yeah, I'm just giving some reassurance to the parents listening who think that like you can just avoid all the hard stuff by feeding your kid perfectly or feeding yourself perfectly, and you'll probably hit some rough patches and you'll get through it.
Well, if you had to pick your top 3 most nutrient dense foods for boosting fertility, what would they be?
Oysters and any bivalve shellfish, so clams, mussels as well. Super rich in zinc, selenium, iron, B12. You got DHA, iodine, taurine. Shellfish is pretty high in taurine. All those things are a net benefit to fertility. So that's a big one. People think of oysters as an aphrodisiac, and they're not wrong. I mean, it has a lot of nutrients that are really supportive of both egg and sperm quality. Next one would be, it's like hard to choose because I want to say red meat, but I also want to say organ meats. Not that people are eating huge amounts of organ meats, but having a little bit of organ meats like every week or two, maybe up to 3 to 6 ounces a week, is just a huge boost to your micronutrient intake. Vitamin A, for example, plays a huge role in both egg quality and sperm quality and hormone production. Like you can actually, if you subject male rats to a vitamin A deficient diet, their testosterone production plummets and their sperm production plummets as well. It's like a switch that you can turn on and off. So I do really like including some organ meats. Like people have gone a little crazy with organ meats, I think, in recent years, where everybody's like not only eating them, but now everybody's supplementing with multiple types of organ meats every single day. I'm like, whoa, chill. Like a couple ounces a week is fine, and that'll get you there. So organ meats for sure. And then I would say eggs with the yolk, super rich in choline. That's highly supportive of all of our like methylation in all of our cells, which plays a role in egg and sperm quality, keeps homocysteine levels down. High homocysteine is a risk factor for early miscarriage, for example, and a whole host of other things. I mean, eggs are a pretty easy protein source for most people to get down. High protein, high in a lot of different, vitamins and minerals that they might not be getting otherwise if they're not eating them.
How long prior to conception should one start, like what is the window in which one ought to be thinking about their prenatal nutrition?
So from a minimum perspective, I'd say 3 to 6 months. And the reason for that is the time it takes for an egg and sperm to develop. So for sperm, it's like a little over 70 days for development. For an egg, technically we can go all the way back like 220 days when that egg is first recruited as an underdeveloped follicle. And then the last approximately 3 months is when our nutrient intake has the biggest effect on its development. So for women, it's like 3 to 8 months, perhaps, if you want to go all the way back to those 220 days. And I say this as a minimum because so many people are coming into pregnancy just undernourished, metabolically not very healthy. We have women with underlying ovulatory issues, polycystic ovarian syndrome. You have women who have come off of birth control after being on it for 10, 15, sometimes 20 years. And that can deplete levels of certain nutrients. There's a period of time that your body needs to heal enough for ovarian function to return. So that can be like 8 months in some women. For some women, it's over a year before they start ovulating again. So if we want to give you like a realistic expectation on the lead up to conception, there will be some people who will need more than the 3 to 6 months. I don't want to like give false hope on the amount of time, but somebody who's already eating reasonably well, they might only need like a handful of little tweaks to what they're doing in the last couple months leading up to conception, and that's all that's needed, you know.
And what about one's body composition? I mean, does body composition play a role?
For sure, yeah. And it can go both ways, interestingly, because on one hand, you can have a woman coming into pregnancy at a heavier weight, higher body fat percentage. That sometimes comes along with insulin resistance, not always. And we know there are delays in conception seen in women who have slightly higher blood sugar levels, even when they're below the pre-diabetic range, by the way. So if we can improve her, insulin sensitivity, build some muscle mass so her body is a little more like metabolically active, whether or not that results in weight loss, like we're improving body composition, that's going to be a net positive. When we get insulin sensitivity dialed in, usually ovulatory function improves, the cycle becomes more regular, which is a sign of, hormone levels being at a good place. And that's like one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is the group that is, sometimes we'd think of them as being super healthy, but they're like highly active, really lean, but they're under fueling. And this can set up a situation known as hypothalamic amenorrhea, where you stop ovulating and stop having a period for a length of time simply because you're not fueling enough. So in those women, sometimes they actually need to gain weight and gain body fat by eating more and potentially cutting back on their exercise or cutting back on the exercise intensity for their hormone production to come back up and for ovulation to resume again. So there's like kind of two camps. Yeah, there's somewhere in the middle that's a sweet spot. Yeah.
Do you have like numbers in terms of a body fat percentage range?
I don't know that I have an upper range, but the lower range typically cited as no less than 22% body fat for ovulatory function. I will say there's exceptions. You will sometimes find like highly athletic individuals who are fueling enough, but they have a low body fat percentage and they're fine. But we start to see issues as you get closer to like 20% body fat or below in women, you're more likely to have issues. I'm not off the top of my head, I don't know that like an upper level is for sure a cause for concern, but what you can do is pay attention to your cycle and the regularity of your cycle. If you're seeing delays in ovulation, for example, or if you've gotten a full workup and it looks like you might have signs of PCOS, then that may be a sign for some that they're on maybe the higher body fat percentage, or that they just need to work on improving their insulin sensitivity. PCOS is quite complicated, so I don't want to like put it in a box as this one little like nice tidy package, because it really varies case to case. But generally speaking, there's kind of like those two camps that we're thinking about mechanistically with what could be impairing fertility.
Got it. So, but in general, like as a general broad strokes rule of thumb, it's generally not good to be underweight or overweight. There exists like a sweet spot, and that's going to vary from person to person.
Correct.
Got it. You mentioned blood sugar a few times. What would you say the best ways to stabilize blood sugar are?
Eating enough protein. First and foremost, eat enough protein. Second to that, I would say pay attention to the quality and quantity of carbohydrates you're eating. Again, the quantity will probably naturally be dialed in if you're eating enough protein. But the quality is something to think about. Like, are you getting mostly processed foods and, crackers, chips, cereals, white breads, those kinds of things? Or are you getting mostly, sweet potatoes and fruit and legumes and unprocessed sources? Yeah.
I noticed on your Instagram, you make your own sourdough bread.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Is that on the table, so to speak?
It's on the table. Yeah, so I mean, when you make sourdough, it's fascinating, but the fermentation process does cut down on the glycemic index of the sourdough. So some of the carbs are like eaten up during the fermentation, but also you're producing beneficial like acids from the fermentation as byproducts that help with reducing the, glycemic index of the total bread. It really depends on whether your sourdough is going to be like good for you or not good for you, based on how you're doing the fermentation. So if you're just like buying sourdough bread at the grocery store, most of the sourdough bread is not actually traditionally fermented sourdough bread. Like it should have 3 ingredients. It should have the flour, water, and salt. They might list starter, but starter is just made with flour and water. So it's kind of redundant. It should be that simple. If you see yeast on the ingredient, there's a good chance this wasn't like a long fermented, traditionally made sourdough bread. And then they've added acids to make it taste sour.
Oh no.
But it's not like real sourdough bread. Like if you can, make it yourself or get it from a store where you can read the ingredients, or a bakery where it has just those 3 ingredients, it's actually been fermented.
Wow, so it could just be normal white bread cosplaying a sourdough bread because they've added some vinegar or something?
Most of it is. If it's like squishy like a loaf of white bread, it's not real sourdough.
Whoa.
You got to look at the ingredients, man.
Yeah, of course. Of course. I happen to love a good sourdough, and I know that it is for people who are sensitive to gluten. I've read that the fermentation process can break down some of those proteins that would otherwise be hard to digest.
Yeah, especially with a long fermentation of like 48 to 72 hours. Yeah. Yeah, I have a blog article called Lily's Sourdough Bread or something like that. And I like go through the method, and naturally I go through a lot of the research on like the reduction in gluten, the increase in certain micronutrients, like there's some B vitamins, some protein that's created in the fermentation, the glycemic index aspect. So yeah, I mean, I've worn a CGM multiple times. I can have a slice of my sourdough, with a meal, so I'm not eating it by itself, and it really doesn't spike my blood sugar at all. But if I'm having like white bread or like store-bought wheat bread or something, I'm going to see a spike.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is there, because we've talked a bit about prioritizing protein, is there any concern with regards to eating too much protein? Like, can you overeat protein? I'm sure some are wondering.
I think in rare instances you could, but it would be hard to do unless you're living off of like isolated protein powders. I think when you're eating whole foods, you're naturally just going to hit a satiety point where you're not going to be able to eat more. So like an example of this, they had a study on PCOS where they assigned women to a high protein diet to see if that improved their symptoms and ovulatory function. And they put them on a 40% of calories coming from protein diet, which is pretty high protein. That's pretty hard to do. And they even had to meet with dietitians multiple times to like counsel them on high protein eating. And still at the end of the study, the high protein group, although they saw major improvements in their PCOS, they were only eating like 26% of calories from protein. So when you're doing it from whole foods, it is kind of a challenge. Again, there's always rare exceptions, like somebody going crazy with the protein powders, or somebody who's maybe on like a bodybuilding protocol where you can eat so much protein that you're not hungry enough to eat other foods, and that results in you undereating. And in a caloric deficit, you're going to see issues with the menstrual cycle. But for the most part, up to a gram per pound of body weight, 2.2 grams per kilo, I'm totally fine with.
What is an ideal, like, I don't know, putting this all in practical terms, like what would your ideal pro-fertility breakfast, lunch, and dinner look like?
So I like to calculate protein needs based on body weight, so I know that I'm like meeting what somebody needs. But for most women, like 25, 30, 35 grams of protein per meal makes a lot of sense. So breakfast could look like an omelet with a couple eggs, and yes, a couple eggs, not just one. Maybe some cheese on there for a little extra protein, or like a side of sausage or something with it. Some sauteed vegetables maybe with it. Do like a spinach omelet with cheese, right? That would be like a great fertility supportive breakfast. Hey, if you like sourdough bread, put a slice of sourdough with some butter on the side, or maybe a piece of fruit, something like that. Lunch and dinner could be similar, probably including some type of seafood. That's a net benefit to fertility. So let's say like salmon salad with, I don't know, put whatever you want on it, like avocado, like a sprinkling of, nuts and seeds, a good like olive oil vinaigrette, kind of a salad dressing. For people who do better with more carbs, maybe you add some like sweet potato to it, or again, piece of fruit on the side. And then dinner, again, having your protein first and foremost. For most women, like 3 to 5 ounces of protein, but you're going to have people on the extremes who are really tiny and not very active that might need as much protein, and somebody who's bigger, more muscular, more athletic, they might need, 6, 7 ounces of protein. You never know. But I would do like steak, and steak, potatoes, and broccoli, like something really like straightforward. The old school, like meat and potatoes, this idea that that's bad for you, I think is just a complete lie. That's
a great
like
meal.
One of the best meals. Like, give me like a pot roast with, carrots and celery, onions and potatoes, and like I am satisfied and happy.
You can even make homemade French fries, and they can be perfectly healthy. I mean, potatoes
100%.
are a great source of fiber, potassium.
Yep.
Use a healthy oil like extra virgin olive oil or avocado oil. There's
Yeah.
nothing fast food about properly made French fries.
Totally. We do oven French fries all the time, and, lard or tallow or coconut oil or something. And yeah, they're delicious. Everybody likes them. Good source of potassium. So I'm a fan.
Is there any concern with regards to red meat? Like some people, listening, I've gotten questions in the past, like how many times a week is safe to consume red meat? Any concerns there?
I don't personally subscribe to that mindset, so we include red meat in the sample meal plans and Real Food for Fertility pretty regularly, because it's so high in so many different nutrients. A lot of the studies, you have to be really careful when you're interpreting fertility studies. There's one I can think of in particular where they were looking at types of protein intake and ovulatory function. And the title of the study made it sound like plant protein and fish were superior for ovulatory function, and red meat was harmful. And even the discussion, the results, the conclusion, the abstract, like all the major parts of the study that most people are going to read made it just sound like plant protein is going to save the world, and fish, of course, right? Everybody's happy with fish too. When you actually looked at it, like I went in and was looking at the data tables where they're looking at the odds ratios for ovulatory issues, and red meat was net neutral or slightly beneficial. And not all of the plant proteins were beneficial. Soy was a net negative. Meat alternatives were a net negative. Legumes, highly supportive of ovulatory function, which I'm also a fan of. Eat your beans and lentils if you like them, right? But the one of the worst ones was, the meat alternatives, the soy, and also an excess of nuts and seeds can be an issue too. But meat was neutral. Fish was beneficial. Like, it was completely a misnaming of the study. I mean, obviously intentionally done, but a misrepresentation of the data. So you have to be kind of cautious as you're reading through those studies. Like, we even put a section in the vegetarian chapter of Real Food for Fertility on like, but I heard meat is bad for my fertility, because I wanted to go through some of the issues with the studies. If you just read the abstract of them, you're going to be like, oh, everything that Lily says is bullshit. But when you actually read the study, you're like, wait a second, what? Right? Or if you look at population-wide studies, a lot of times the people who are consuming the most meat are ignoring all the other health advice, right? We've all been told meat is bad for us, so don't eat much meat if you want to be healthy. So you have these individuals eating less meat, but also they're the ones who are exercising, they're eating vegetables, they're not drinking sugared sodas, they're not smoking, they don't drink alcohol, they sleep, they manage their stress. And so, you have this healthy user bias that comes into play with it as well.
That, makes total sense. So sometimes in these observational studies, and it's important for people to recognize that observational studies cannot prove cause and effect. They can only tease out correlations, which are maybe useful for hypothesis generation, but they don't prove anything. And so You'll often in these studies see plant protein perform sometimes way better than animal source protein, particularly red meat, because of this like healthy user bias effect, that people who consume more plant protein or even fish protein, they tend to be more health conscious.
Yep.
As compared to meat consumers.
Yep.
And especially, I don't think it's anywhere more clear than the observational data on processed meat, because processed meat, I mean, is often like forms hot dogs and the meat that you get in Subway sandwiches. So for somebody who's regularly eating hot dogs or Subway sandwiches, I mean, that's not like a health conscious consumer.
Exactly.
Just going out on a limb to say that. Somebody who's regularly eating Subway sandwiches. And a lot of this data comes from food frequency questionnaires, which are notoriously unreliable.
Nutrition research is really tough, which is why you try to get your hypotheses formed from these observational studies or epidemiological studies, and then you need to go back and test it in a clinical trial or a controlled feeding study. And by default, controlled feeding studies where all the food is being made in like a metabolic kitchen, and you have people who are literally admitted to basically a hospital, being served all their meals. Maybe they have their caloric intake exactly measured so they know they're matching exactly down to the calorie what they need. Those studies are small, so you only have a handful of participants. And then people throw out the results of that, oh, it's too small of a sample size. I'm like, you're missing the point. Like, the point of these studies is different than some of these other ones. We're actually putting that hypothesis to the test.
Yeah, there's discordance. Mm-hmm. Totally. And those kinds of randomized controlled trials they're few and far between anyway, because they're expensive to run, they're arduous, and yeah, usually they're super short term. Like they're a couple weeks at most.
Yep.
It's got to be frustrating being a nutrition professional and, seeing the missiles fly overhead of like all this super weak data that people love to argue about. It's frustrating for me, but I'm not a dietitian.
Well, this is why I write books that have 1 million citations, because it takes a lot to unpack. And, that's kind of the challenge too, is that because there are so many misconceptions that you want to unpack, I would love to just put out a 1-pager that's like, just eat this and everything's fine. No one's going to listen to it because they're like, well, what about this? And what about that? And what about this? And I'm one of the people who is happy to dig into the literature and give you the answers. But then you end up, that book's over 500 pages and 2,300 plus citations, because there's so much to unpack and so many misconceptions to undo. And that takes like time and effort. And just a lot of people are not willing to do it, let alone read it. There's a lot of people who just don't even want to read books anymore. We want to have everything spoon-fed to us in a 15-second reel. And you can't get into the details in that format.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. Are there labs and biomarkers that tend to be reflective of one's fertility that people ought to, I guess, keep tabs on?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, blood sugar and insulin levels would be one of the first ones that I'd recommend. Like I said, we do have data showing that when blood sugar is averaging a little bit higher, it takes longer for a woman to conceive. So we really want to be keeping blood sugar levels in a more optimal range, not just like avoiding prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, but actual optimal physiologically normal blood sugar levels, and also keeping insulin in check. I mean, we have insulin receptors all over our bodies, and including in our ovaries. And when your insulin levels are chronically high, like we see in somebody with insulin resistance, you start to see ovulatory issues, namely PCOS. So if we can keep blood sugar and insulin in a good range, we're happy campers. A lot of my work has also been in looking at how can we reduce the risk of certain pregnancy complications or manage them, like gestational diabetes. Really, a lot of that starts preconception. Like, we need to start pregnancy with better metabolic health, and blood sugar and insulin are one of those markers that reflects that. Lipid levels are something to potentially look at. And interestingly, for women, I'm often looking at, like, are their HDL levels sufficient enough? Because we need enough cholesterol to fuel our sex steroid hormone synthesis or progesterone and estrogen levels. So when you have women whose cholesterol levels are way too low, we can run into issues. Sometimes if a woman's triglyceride levels are running really high, that's usually a sign of some dysglycemia going on. So the blood sugar issues playing a role in the triglycerides, that's something to look at. Certain inflammatory markers can be helpful to look at, like C-reactive protein or homocysteine. Homocysteine can be a surrogate marker of folate status, B12 status, vitamin B6 status, and a whole slew of other nutrients that are involved in methylation. And you're simply not going to have great egg quality when you have high homocysteine levels. So that is one to check. And then that could lead to, if that's high, maybe there's a need to test for some other micronutrients, for example. Vitamin D levels are really vital. Thyroid hormone levels. I mean, you can get into all the different like ovarian markers and hormone markers if you want to, but there's a lot of places for improvement just by looking at some of the basic ones that your doctor would order.
So fasting blood sugar, fasting insulin, homocysteine, HDL, triglycerides, and those are pretty basic.
Pretty basic.
Yeah. Super interesting. Oftentimes when the topic of fertility comes up these days, the issue of our exposure to endocrine disrupting compounds comes up, like plasticizing chemicals, phthalates, parabens, bisphenols.
Yeah.
Do those concern you? And if so, how do we mitigate our exposure to those kinds of chemicals?
Yeah, they do concern me. And we don't want to like raise the alarm and have everybody freak out about everything, because sometimes there's exposures that are just inevitable and unavoidable in our environment. But when it comes to our daily habits, yes, I think that's an area we should be looking at. A lot of these chemicals are estrogen mimicking hormones, xenoestrogens, they call them. So these estrogen mimicking compounds can create issues with our hormone levels, both in men and women, by the way. So plasticizers are some of the big ones, the phthalates, BPA, all the BPA alternatives like BPS and BPF. And they've come up with all these different ones where they just tweak the molecule tiniest bit. They can put BPA free on the label, but it has these other plasticizing chemicals in it. So just less plastics as much as you have control over, particularly when you're reheating foods in the microwave, for example. Reheat in glass or reheat it on the stovetop in your pan. Don't put plastics or styrofoam in the microwave. Not only does some of the compounds go into the food, but they're released into the air, some of them, phthalates especially, and then you're breathing them in. Personal care products can be a huge source of chemical exposure for women. We know that women who work in, the hairstyling world, they tend to have more fertility issues, more endometriosis, and some of that could be related to all different chemicals that are in the products they're using. Parabens being one of them, but there's an array. Even the, all the perfumes and fragrances, a lot of those have parabens in it, phthalates in them, and a whole slew of chemicals that we don't even know what they are. So cleaner personal care products that are either scented with essential oils or unscented would be my recommendation. Even things like what you're cooking your food in. If you're cooking in, scratched up 15-year-old nonstick cookware, guess what? Some of those compounds are making it into your food. Even if your pan is brand new and perfect condition, but you preheat it to a really high level before there's food in it, like some of those compounds do aerosolize. So the perfluorinated chemicals can be, a major issue. Heavy metals, there's a slew of them. I would say one of the best things you could do is, get a water filter if you're not sure that your water is clean. Avoid storing or heating foods in plastic. Try to use more like glass or stainless steel containers for your foods. Clean up any of the household products, the dish soap, the laundry detergent, the shampoo, conditioner, hair products, and that alone is going to make a huge, huge difference.
Such great advice. Yeah. Today, Grubhub, Postmates, super common. And oftentimes people will get food delivered to their house, and it comes in, whether you're taking out or you're getting food delivered, comes in this food wrapping, and PFAS chemicals will be surface applied to these wrappers to make them oil and waterproof. And oftentimes people, I know people that will not think twice before reheating their food in the microwave, still wrapped in these food wrappers that are coated with PFAS, which are known endocrine disruptors, have a known impact on fertility, potentially cancer, implicated in cancer, certain cancers. It's Yeah, I mean, it's like it's.
Did you ever have a Hot Pockets from the 90s?
Yeah.
Yeah, those little wrappers with the like gray coating, like plastic. That stuff was probably loaded with plastics and PFAS and
Microwave popcorn.
Microwave popcorn is a big contributor to PFAS intake. Yeah. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's so hard because at the end of the day, like, I'm going to order takeout every once in a while and I'm going to get, the piping hot tom kha guy Thai soup in a plastic container. Yeah. And, it's not perfect and it is what it is. But I think making those sorts of choices, few and far between and trying to cook at home does go a long way. Again, we don't have to be perfect, but it's about reducing the like frequency at which we are having all of these exposures. So it's tricky. I mean, everything in the grocery store is packaged in plastic. What are you supposed to do? You get your like grass-fed beef share straight from the farm and it's shrink wrapped in plastic in your freezer. Like, you're going to have some exposure. The big one is the reheating in those containers. That is a more easily modifiable risk factor, right? Like, we can all not reheat the plastic container in the microwave. We can all get a glass or stainless steel coffee mug instead of doing the, take out one from Starbucks or whatever. So all those little choices add up.
Yeah, the way I think about it is if you're applying heat, you're catalyzing the migration of these chemicals into your food. Like I'm drinking iced cold brew out of a plastic cup right now, but because it's iced, it's cold, the coffee's not been heated, it wasn't poured into the cup when hot because it's cold brew.
Yep.
I feel a little bit less like that's less treacherous of a
100%.
Of a behavior as compared to like if I get food and it arrives at my doorstep and it's not hot and I want to reheat it, I take it out of the container or the wrapper that it's in.
Yeah. And we do that even if I get like a frozen entree from the grocery store, like I don't know, something from Trader Joe's or whatever. I'll take it out of the plastic coated cardboard container and put it in like a glass Pyrex and cook it in the oven or the toaster oven instead of putting that plastic thing. Who knows? That was probably loaded with hot food when they first made it in the factory, you know what I mean? But I'm taking away one of the additional exposures, right? And maybe you're doing a takeout or a pre-made meal once or twice a week instead of 3 times a day, right? It's still going to be a net benefit. So I like to look at kind of like micro, like levels up, where can we make a little improvement?
Yeah. I think drinking water out of glass is like I make an effort now if I'm ever buying bottled water. Like I go the extra distance and I'll pay the extra money to make sure that whatever it is that I'm buying, it's like in glass as opposed to plastic.
Yeah.
Because you don't know how that water was stored prior to it arriving at the point of sale. I do this actually whenever I travel. Whenever I travel, I will Instacart. If I'm in a hotel room for like a talk or something that I have to give, I'll Instacart bottled water in glass to the hotel room so that I don't have to drink whatever they, like
there you go.
The Poland Spring or what have you that's often waiting for me. Yeah, like little tweaks I feel like can, when added up, make a big difference.
Yeah.
Are you a fan of supplementation like prenatals for women, for men, or do you feel like if you're optimizing your diet around nutrient-dense foods, they're extraneous?
At the end of the day, most people are just not consuming all the micronutrients they need from food. Even people trying really hard. I mean, you run their nutrient intake through Chronometer, no affiliation, it's free. You can track your food in there and you'll see how much you fall short.
What is that, an app?
Yeah, it's a free app for meal tracking and nutrient analysis. And the benefit of that one is that it'll give you your micronutrient intake as well. It's not just focused on calories and macros. It'll give you those as well. It has some defaults where it doesn't. So many of these apps are so focused on weight loss that it's very in your face that you're like, you ate too many calories, you're eating too much fat. It's like it really like aggressive and kind of drives disordered eating behaviors in my opinion. But this one is a little calmer. You can set it to net carbs instead of total carbs if you want. So you're not freaking out about the 14 grams of carbs that you got from your avocado 12 or 13 of which were fiber, right?
Right.
But yeah, so you could do a nutrient analysis and see where you're at, but a lot of people are really falling low on nutrients. I mean, I remember before my second pregnancy, I ran like a full micronutrient panel on myself, and I would consider myself decently healthy. I try to, walk the walk and practice what I preach. And I was low in a number of things that I wouldn't have expected. And I had been decent about supplementing, not perfect, but I'd been nursing my firstborn for like 2 years, right? So yeah, you get depleted in nutrients over time. So I am a fan of supplementation. I think a comprehensive prenatal makes a lot of sense. If your vitamin D levels are running low, supplementing with that and or getting sufficient sun exposure so that you keep your levels up. Magnesium often needs to be supplemented separately. Iodine is a big one, plays a huge role in fertility, and we're seeing suboptimal iodine status in at least half of US women. Everybody thinks we're iodine replete in the US because we have, iodized salt, and we're not. People are not consuming enough. When you track their iodine status with urinary iodine concentrations, you see over half of women are too low in iodine.
Where do you get your iodine? Like, I don't use iodized salt.
Yeah, that's the other thing. A lot of people don't. Well, even if you do, a lot of the iodine just dissipates with heat, light, humidity. So, you get iodine from seafood primarily. That's the best source. Seaweed is the most, nutrient dense source or richest source of iodine, but all your fish and shellfish would be the next best. And then from there, it's mostly dairy and eggs. So for vegetarians and vegans, for example, when you look at iodine status across the population, vegetarians have lower status than omnivores, and vegans have the lowest status of all, unless you're pretty regularly consuming seaweed and kelp and stuff like that. You're not going to be getting enough. And a lot of prenatals don't include iodine in it for some reason. So when I say comprehensive prenatal, those are ones that have like the full array of your micronutrients, not just vitamins, but minerals as well, because a lot of them don't. So those would be like some of the, basic nutrients to supplement. There's all sorts of additional supplements that could be taken for optimizing certain things, right? We have like inositol, which is a B vitamin-like compound, been really extensively studied in the fertility space, particularly for women with PCOS, because it plays such a major role in controlling insulin resistance, but also improves, egg quality, ovulatory function, and so on and so forth. So that could be one. There's some amino acids that are highly beneficial, like L-carnitine, a number of antioxidant-like compounds that can be really beneficial. So it kind of depends on a case-by-case basis what's needed.
Are you a fan of We-Natal? I have no affiliation with them, but I'm friends with Ronit and Vita. We've had them on the podcast.
I haven't looked closely enough. Oh, that's nice. Yeah. I haven't looked closely enough to see if that meets my standards, but I'll check it out.
Yeah, I found their Pre-Natal for men to be, which is very interesting, like a prenatal for men, a very interesting concept, but I found it to be just in general a really good multivitamin, and I was taking it for... I actually decided to take it for a month prior to I had back surgery, and I found it to be rich in a lot of nutrients that are particularly supportive of like wound healing.
Yeah.
And I actually also froze my sperm prior to the surgery, and so I thought that was like a, killing two birds with one stone sort of thing, to be taking a multivitamin that also doubles as a male prenatal. And in my from my non-expert vantage point on fertility, like it seemed like a really solid choice.
I think for a lot of people, it's just like a prenatal is kind of an insurance policy. A prenatal is really just a high quality multivitamin, right? There's no legal requirements a supplement company has to meet to call it a prenatal or a men's multi or a women's multi or whatever. That's all marketing. But to me, like a comprehensive prenatal is simply one that's a really high quality multivitamin that's, hitting all the marks for your micronutrients.
If you could give just one fertility tip that applies to everyone, what would it be?
Well, since I've talked about food, I'll choose a different one. Find a way to, manage your stress. Sleep. Find a way to make your life a little more, I don't know, fun and lighthearted. You know, stress plays a huge role in our hormone production. It's one of the risk factors for women for hypothalamic amenorrhea when they're really stressed out. That tends to have carryover effects to all sorts of other things, right? Our cortisol is going to drive up our blood sugar. It's going to affect our thyroid function. Ultimately, it's going to affect our hypothalamus, which then affects ovarian hormone production. Like, it has this whole cascade of effects. When your body is feeling stress, you're going to be burning through a lot of different micronutrients at higher levels, especially your magnesium and some of your electrolytes and your B vitamins and your vitamin C. Like, you're just using up resources dealing with the stress. So we all live like crazy stressed out lifestyles, right? So can we like find a way to chill a little bit, take a little bit off of our plate? I think that goes a really long way.
Well, there's good stress and there's bad stress, right? Are you talking about, you know, like the kind of stress that might be imposed when you're doing a high intensity workout or sauna or cold plunge? Or are you talking more about, you know, like psychological stress, chronic stress?
I mean, chronic stress mostly, but some of those other things that are sort of hormetic stressors that stress you out for a little while and then you come back down. For some women, those take them over the edge and can be problematic. Like high intensity interval training, for example. If you have a woman who's already like teetering on what we call like the hypothalamic amenorrhea spectrum, they have signs and symptoms that their menstrual cycle and ovulatory function is not optimal. Maybe they spot before their period. Maybe they have really bad PMS. Maybe their period is really light. Maybe the time between ovulation and their period starting, which is called your luteal phase, maybe that's really short. These are all signs that you're like really close to losing your cycle. Like, your hormone production is already not that great. So if you start adding on an additional stressor, which your body has to expend energy to recover from, and you're not taking in enough energy to actually recover, or taking the time, enough of a break to actually recover, it can be a net negative for women. Men are much better able to handle those sorts of stressors. Women, our cycles are pretty sensitive. So, you know, it depends on what's going on. If you have somebody with, you know, insulin resistance, like pretty high body fat percentage, high intensity interval training, resistance training might be exactly what their body needs to build some muscle mass and improve their metabolic efficiency. If somebody is like already kind of teetering on this, I almost am not having a period anymore, or they full blown do not have a period anymore, I wouldn't encourage high intensity interval training. And I probably wouldn't encourage them to stress their body out more with cold plunges or something. Maybe sauna would be a little bit better tolerated, but you got a calorie burn from saunas too. So whenever you're engaging in those things that are expending more energy, you got to consume enough energy. We just have like it's terrifying how many women are just way under eating these days. You cut back calories like 25% or just under fuel your higher energy needs by just 25%, and you can lose your cycle within a couple months.
Why do you think women today are so prone to undereating?
Diet culture, unnatural body standards. I don't know. I mean, in some ways, you're like praised by society if you engage in a lot of exercise. Like, oh, you're going to run a marathon? Wow, congratulations. Oh my gosh, you're so healthy. Oh, you're going vegan or vegetarian, or you're on some diet that's like eliminating 25 foods. Like, wow, that's great. You're going to feel so good after this cleanse. Like, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know why it's so prevalent, but it seems to be it's a cultural, societal thing.
Well, so for a woman who doesn't tolerate these acute hormetic stressors well, like high intensity exercise, would you say the right course of action is to avoid those activities, or rather to look at how you're fueling your body, how you are or aren't prioritizing recovery? Like, where does one start? Because I mean, exercise has so many benefits in terms of long-term health, brain health, etc.
Yeah. So, I mean, I take it in a case-by-case basis. If you have somebody who is, they're working out 4, 5, 6 days a week without sufficient rest and for fairly long periods of time, and they're not fueling enough, I mean, the first place to look is the fuel. Like, are you able to actually fuel enough? But for some women, I mean, if you're really trying to support like an elite athlete level of performance, I mean, you might need as much food as a man. And that's like hard to consume, 3,500, 4,000 calories a day. Like, I'm just throwing out a random number, but some of these studies, you have women where it's like, we've identified your calorie needs are 2,900, but the societal idea is that women need like 1,800 calories, or it's not unusual for me to have clients who need like, they're eating, 1,500 calories, or they're on a 1,200 calorie diet. Like, they're just way under fueling for what their expenditure is. So if we can actually get to the point where they're fueling enough, then maybe you can maintain that. Obviously, we have, elite level athletes who are still able to cycle because they are fueling appropriately, but it's kind of a full-time job. Like, it's a lot of work. So sometimes when we've tried that and people have kind of maxed out, like, I can't eat any more food, we might need to reduce the exercise a little bit. We might need to work on finding ways of having stress release that don't involve such a high amount of energy expenditure. I mean, there is such a thing as compulsive exercise. People get addicted to it.
Yeah.
So if that's going on, then sometimes the answer is to pull back. But first and foremost, I'm usually looking at how they're fueling. The other part of it is like, the way that we approach athletic nutrition, I think, is a little bit crazy pants because they're focused so much on the carbs. And when you look at women who have hypothalamic amenorrhea, it's not that they're under consuming carbs. Like, they're getting most of their calories from carbs. They're way under consuming fat and also typically under consuming protein. So a lot of times we need to give them more of the raw materials that they're actually using for hormone production. No issue with the carbs. Keep eating the carbs. Like, you need the carbs too. But if we're going to make up that caloric deficit, we need to do that by increasing the protein and fat. Because if you're under consuming fat, I mean, we've done trials on low-fat diets in women. They were looking at, if we reduce the fat intake, can we reduce estrogen levels to prevent breast cancer later on? Like, that was the reason for doing the research the way that they did. You end up dropping production of estrogen and progesterone anywhere from like 20 to 50%. So we need to be eating the fat. And so many women are still coming off of like the 1980s dietary guidelines and now like the plant-based craze where they're so under consuming fat and protein that we end up with more of these issues. How are you going to recover from exercise and repair if you're not eating enough of those? How are you going to achieve any sort of like nervous system stability when your blood sugar is doing this all day long from just eating high carb and under eating fat and protein? Like, it doesn't add up. It doesn't work.
But for women who are struggling to get in more calories, like, aren't they coming up against the impact of eating such satiating foods? I mean, you earlier you brought up a really fascinating point that sometimes, like, one of the potential, though rare, downsides of eating too much protein is that it could be too satiating.
Yeah.
Thus making it difficult to get in calories from other macronutrients.
Yeah. So in these cases, I usually am trying to point them towards whole food protein sources that have their fat intact. Because when you look at like where we're getting our calories from food, each macronutrient has a number of calories per amount of food, and fat has more than double the amount of calories in a smaller serving size than our protein and carbs. So if we get them enough protein, but we're not taking all the fat out of it, so we're doing full fat dairy products, we're doing steak and not cutting the fat out of it, maybe you're doing 80-20 burgers instead of 99% fat-free chicken burger or something. We're leaving the yolks in the eggs. We're adding avocado to your lunch, right? Like, we're just increasing the fat in proportion to an increase in the protein. I don't think you run into that issue quite as frequently. But you can, like, there are people when you go too low carb, for example, like, it's highly satiating and you also burn more calories. So you don't want to go too low carb in somebody who needs to consume more calories, because now their body has become even more efficient at burning calories, and yet we need to make up for a deficit, right? So there's like a fine balance with trying to like balance all of this stuff together. I can just say from experience with so many clients with HA, they really do need to be like working on that macronutrient balance a little more. A lot of times they're coming from a calorie restrictive, fat restrictive mindset. And that holds up with what we tend to see in the research as well. I mean, one way to achieve a really small body size is to just restrict your calories. And the easiest way to restrict your calories is to cut your fat intake, you know?
Yeah. So many women today just, I feel like they've been programmed with this like smaller is better mindset. Yeah. It's a problem.
Yeah.
Man, well, your work is so valuable. I love having you in here, and I think everybody should pick up Real Food for Fertility. Who'd you write it for? Did you write it for people who are actively trying to conceive? Is it something that all women should read? Like, who is your target audience for this book?
So Real Food for Fertility is like a brainchild between my colleague Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. Her and I co-authored it together. And we were trying to come up with a resource on fertility that would be kind of an all-in-one solution. So she's a fertility awareness educator. She wrote The Fifth Vital Sign. She'd have clients coming to her trying to conceive, and then she'd be like, okay, read this book and then also get Lily's book, Real Food for Pregnancy, and just eat that. And I'd have people like, hey, what should I eat before I conceive? I'm like, well, read Real Food for Pregnancy and then make sure you know your cycle and know how to time sex for conception and all that other stuff in The Fifth Vital Sign. We're like, just read each other's books. And we're like, okay, there's topics that are missing that we haven't covered in either one. There's so much nuance in the nutrition space. So many, what about this? What about ovarian aging? What about low AMH? What about PCOS? What about endometriosis? What about fibroids? What about recurrent miscarriage? There's just so many topics that weren't broached or not in enough detail in any of the other resources that we're like, we need to create this one source. And we also wanted to include the man in this as well. So we put a whole very detailed chapter on sperm quality in there. So not only do we cover the egg quality and all the fertility concerns, but we're also covering sperm quality because up to half of infertility cases have some male factor involvement, and up to 30% of those is just the man's fault, okay? And yet women take all the burden for fertility challenges. So it really is technically written for the individuals who are trying to conceive. I would also say anybody who is not pregnant and wanting to optimize their nutrition, like not currently pregnant, even if you're done having kids, even if you're heading into perimenopause, even if you're 20, not ready to have kids for who knows how long, this is a way that supports your hormone health. For women, supports your menstrual cycle health. For men, we're supporting sperm quality, metabolic health, all the things. Fertility is essentially just a reflection of your overall well-being. You know, if your body is not optimally healthy, one of the first places you're going to see it is in, for women, issues with the menstrual cycle and your hormones. And in men, you can get a sperm quality analysis a lot easier than we can get our egg quality assessed. You'll see poor sperm quality parameters. Those correlate with poor metabolic health, cardiovascular issues, blood sugar issues, and whatnot. So it's like we're looking at keeping you optimally healthy so that by the time you want to conceive, you're ready. Like everything's good to go.
Well, I would recommend your work to anybody. And it's actually fascinating. You're mirroring something that I heard. I think it was also from the Pre-Natal girls that, because we were having a conversation. I had my sperm quality tested when I had it frozen recently, and it was in like top 1% of like morphology, mobility. I don't know if that's motility. Yeah, there you go.
Same thing.
Same thing. Yeah. And I was very proud of that fact. But it's interesting because it's sort of like, it's not something that you can't see your sperm quality, like you can't see it, right? So it's in a way, it's sort of like, it is a perfect surrogate endpoint because it's not something that you can directly like manipulate on a day-to-day basis. You have to have the tools to be able to see, you know, the labs to be able to see like how well your sperm is doing. So it's not something that you can directly manipulate.
Yep.
But the fact that it mirrors your physical health so so reliably. I think it just like logically makes sense. And yeah, I was very pleased.
And for you to be labeled infertile, your sperm quality would have to drop to below the 5th percentile for it to qualify as infertile.
So it'd have to be really bad.
Have to be really bad. Like the cutoff for infertility is like really, really low. It's below the 5th percentile of a huge data set of men that they assessed.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's this in-between range we talk about in the sperm quality chapter, but there's like overt infertility, then there's this sort of subfertile range, and then there's optimally fertile, right? And it's like, so a lot of times we have to look at the exact numbers that are coming in on the test to assess like what it means. Because a lot of times a man will go and get a semen analysis and they're like, yep, everything's fine, you're fine. But they could be at the 6th percentile of sperm quality and they're fine, right? So anyway, for anybody who's listening and has an analysis, look at the charts in the sperm quality chapter and compare your numbers.
Would you recommend that men get their sperm quality tested? And is that something easy to do? I mean, I did it because I was going to get it frozen, so I paid the fee in order to do that. But are there like at-home tests, like consumer-facing tests that make it easier?
I don't know about an at-home test, but I don't think it's all that hard to request. And it's obviously not that hard to get a sample. Like if you try to assess egg quality for women, it's like you have to go in and retrieve an egg.
Yeah.
Or you're looking at these surrogate markers, which are not a perfect reflection of egg quality, like AMH, AFC, and some others. So it's trickier.
Yeah. Well, Lily, thanks so much for coming in. This was super fun. Where can my listeners connect with you on social media, and where can they pick up your book?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram, so at Lily Nichols RDN. My website's the same, lilynicholsrdn.com. And book, probably easiest place to get it would be Amazon.
Wonderful. Last question that gets asked everybody on the show. What does living a genius life mean to you?
For right now, since I'm like coming off of a time zone change, getting enough sleep.
Love it. I hear that. Well, thanks again for coming up.
Thank you.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.